It was an ordinary morning when Mark, a young boy with a learning disability, got ready for school. His sister, Emma, watched him with a mixture of concern and love. Mark struggled every day with tasks that other kids found easy. Simple things like reading, writing, and even following directions were challenges for him. His schoolwork was always a bit harder, and his classmates sometimes teased him, which only made things worse. But Emma knew Mark wasn't any different from other kids. He had a big heart and a curious mind. He just needed more time and patience. Emma had always been his biggest supporter. Every day after school, she'd help him with his homework, sitting patiently as he tried again and again to solve math problems or read out loud. Though it often frustrated him, Emma always reassured him, telling him that it was okay to take time, that he wasn't alone, and he would get there eventually. Their bond was special, and Emma always felt that no matter how tough things got, they could face anything together. But at school, things were different. Mark's teacher, Mrs. Hall, was strict and often impatient. Mark's difficulties were sometimes seen as misbehavior. Every day, he had to endure the long hours in a classroom where he didn't always understand the lessons. Mrs. Hall would often raise her voice, telling him to try harder or pay attention, not understanding that it wasn't laziness, but his learning disability that made it so hard for him. Mark tried his best, but it seemed like nothing was ever enough. That day, Mark was a little slower than usual, struggling with a worksheet that everyone else had finished. He didn't understand the instructions, and his pen hovered over the paper as he stared at the jumble of words and numbers. Mrs. Hall noticed right away. Her patience was running thin, and Mark could see it in her eyes. "Come on, Mark. Why can't you just get it together like everyone else?" she snapped, loud enough for the whole class to hear. Mark's face turned red, and he looked down, trying to hide his frustration. It wasn't that he didn't want to understand. It was just so hard. The other kids in the class, who finished their work quickly, started whispering and giggling at him. Mark wanted to shrink into the seat and disappear. He was used to this feeling of being left behind, but it still hurt. After a few more harsh words from Mrs. Hall, the teacher suddenly told Mark to go to the corner of the room. He was told to stay there quietly, away from everyone, a punishment for not finishing his work quickly enough. Mark didn't argue. He simply walked to the corner, feeling his stomach twist with embarrassment. Emma had always told him to stand tall and be proud, but in that moment, it felt impossible. Emma, who sat at home doing her schoolwork, had a gut feeling that something was wrong. She had noticed the change in Mark's mood lately. He seemed more withdrawn, less enthusiastic about school, and sometimes, when she asked him how his day went, he'd only shrug. Emma knew that something wasn't quite right, and she decided to keep a closer eye on things. Little did she know, that feeling would soon lead her down a path she never expected. This was only the beginning of a much bigger story, one that would change everything for Mark and his family. What Emma didn't know yet was just how far things had gone at school, and how she would soon uncover the truth. As days passed, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with Mark's experience at school. He became quieter, and his usual enthusiasm for things seemed to fade. He was more tired when he came home, often slumping into a chair and staring at the TV instead of talking about his day. Emma had always been close to her brother, and she could tell that something was off, even though Mark didn't want to say much about it. One afternoon after school, Emma decided to walk Mark home from school instead of letting him go alone. She had noticed that his steps were slower, and he wasn't smiling as much. They walked in silence for a while, until Emma broke the quiet. "Mark, how was school today? Was Mrs. Hall nicer to you?" she asked, trying to sound casual, though she was worried. Mark shifted uncomfortably, but avoided looking at her. "It was fine," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma didn't believe him. She had seen how he slouched when he came out of class, and how his hand shook as he gathered his things. He wasn't being honest, and she knew it. "Are you sure?" She pressed gently. "You know you can tell me anything." Mark looked at the ground, and after a moment of silence, he spoke. "Mrs. Hall told me I was acting out today. She said I wasn't trying hard enough and put me in the corner. I didn't do anything wrong, Emma," he said, his voice full of confusion. "I just couldn't finish the worksheet. It's hard for me, you know." But she was so mad, and the other kids were looking at me. Emma's heart sank. She had seen Mark struggle before, but hearing it directly from him made it so much more real. She tried to reassure him. "You're not doing anything wrong, Mark. You just learn differently. Mrs. Hall doesn't understand that. You just need more time. And that's okay." Mark nodded, but Emma could tell that her words didn't ease the pain he felt. He had always wanted to fit in, but at school, it was harder for him. Emma couldn't stand seeing him suffer, and she began to feel angry at the way Mark was being treated. It wasn't fair. He deserved to be in an environment where he could learn at his own pace, where his struggles weren't seen as misbehavior, but as part of who he was. Over the next few days, Emma paid more attention to how Mark was acting after school. He was more withdrawn, even avoiding the usual things he loved to do. When he did talk, it was about how frustrating school had become, how everyone expected him to keep up with tasks that felt impossible. Emma began to question if Mrs. Hall was really treating Mark fairly, or if there was more going on behind the scenes. She knew that teachers had tough jobs, but she also knew that they had a responsibility to understand their students, especially those who needed more help. One day, Emma decided to take action. She couldn't just sit back anymore. She started asking around, speaking to other parents and kids she knew, trying to gather information about what really happened in class. Her concern grew as she heard whispers about how Mark wasn't the only one who had faced harsh treatment. Some of the other students confirmed that Mrs. Hall had a reputation for being quick to punish and slow to understand. Emma was shocked, but also more determined than ever to uncover the truth. She knew something needed to change. At the same time, she tried to be there for Mark as much as she could, encouraging him to keep trying and reminding him that he was smart and capable. But deep down, Emma couldn't help but worry. If things didn't change soon, Mark might lose his confidence and stop believing in himself, and that was something she couldn't let happen. Emma's worries continued to grow, and she knew she had to do something to help her brother. She could see the toll that school was taking on Mark, both physically and emotionally. It wasn't just the frustration of struggling with his work. It was also the feeling of being misunderstood and isolated. Every day, he came home looking more defeated than the day before. He put his backpack down with a sigh, avoid making eye contact, and head straight to his room without a word. Emma couldn't stand watching her brother slip further into sadness. One evening, as Emma was sitting at the kitchen table doing her homework, she overheard a conversation between her parents. They were discussing Mark's recent behavior and the difficulties he was having at school. Her mom expressed concern, but her dad, who worked long hours and was often tired, didn't seem to fully understand what was going on. "He's just acting up," her dad said dismissively. "It's probably just a phase. He'll grow out of it." Emma felt a wave of frustration wash over her. How could anyone think that Mark was just acting up? He wasn't being difficult on purpose. He just needed support. The way Mark was being treated at school, especially by Mrs. Hall, made Emma more determined to figure out exactly what was happening during those long school hours. The next morning, Emma decided to take action. She knew she couldn't keep relying on vague reports from other parents or bits of gossip. She needed to see for herself what was going on at school. Emma had an idea. She would secretly observe Mark's class, hoping to catch a glimpse of how things were unfolding in real time. She knew it was risky, but she couldn't ignore her instincts any longer. She had to know the truth. The following day, Emma pretended to head to her friend's house after school, but instead stayed at the edge of the schoolyard, waiting for her opportunity. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched Mark's classmates slowly filter out of the building. She kept her eyes on the door, hoping to spot him so she could follow him discreetly. Finally, she saw him. His head hung low, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He didn't look up or smile at any of his classmates, and Emma could see the exhaustion in his posture. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the day, Emma quickly moved to intercept Mark as he walked toward the school gates. She made sure to keep her distance, not wanting to raise any suspicion. Mark didn't seem to notice her, as he was lost in his own world, clearly weighed down by the day's struggles. Emma followed him for a few more minutes until she saw him turn into a quieter part of the school grounds, where the classrooms had windows that faced the playground. Emma crouched behind a tree, peeking through the leaves to watch the classroom window. She waited quietly, her heart beating faster with each passing moment. Through the window, she could see Mrs. Hall, standing at the front of the class, speaking sternly to the students. Mark was sitting at his desk, head bowed, trying to keep up with the lesson. A few moments later, Emma's stomach sank as she saw the teacher's reaction to Mark's struggles. Mrs. Hall walked over to him, and though Emma couldn't hear what she was saying, she could tell from her body language that she was scolding him. Mark's shoulders slumped further, and he tried to explain something, but Mrs. Hall wasn't listening. She simply pointed toward the corner of the room, and Mark slowly stood up, his face full of defeat. Emma's blood ran cold as she realized what was happening. Mrs. Hall had ordered Mark to the corner, just like she had done so many times before. Mark walked slowly, his head hanging low, as he took his seat in the corner, out of sight of the rest of the class. Emma watched in disbelief, feeling a knot form in her stomach. She could see it now, the harsh treatment that Mark had been facing every single day. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. Mark was being punished for something that was beyond his control. Emma felt a deep sense of anger rise inside her. How could a teacher treat a child like that? How could they not see the pain they were causing? She knew then that she had to act fast. She couldn't just stand by any longer and watch her brother suffer. This wasn't just about schoolwork. It was about Mark's well-being. Emma took a deep breath, promising herself that she would do whatever it took to protect him. The truth was out there, and she was going to find it. After what Emma had witnessed, she knew she couldn't just let things go on like this. The image of Mark standing in the corner of the classroom, isolated and humiliated, stayed with her long after she returned home that day. She couldn't bear the thought of him enduring that kind of treatment every single day. He deserved better. He deserved understanding, not punishment. That evening, as Emma sat at the kitchen table, her mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. She needed more than just suspicion. She needed proof. Emma thought back to when she had overheard the conversation between her parents. Her dad had dismissed Mark's struggles, thinking it was just a phase. He didn't see the full picture. Emma knew she had to show them the truth, but she also knew that it wouldn't be easy. It wasn't just about convincing her parents, but also about getting the school to take her seriously. The idea hit her like a bolt of lightning. She had to record what was happening at school. If she could catch the teacher's behavior on camera, it would be undeniable. The truth would be out in the open. But how could she do it without raising any suspicion? Emma thought for a moment, and then it came to her. She had an old smartphone that she no longer used. She could use it to record the classroom without anyone knowing. The next day, Emma prepared for her mission. She made sure to hide the phone in her pocket and slipped it into her bag, careful not to make it obvious. Her plan was simple. She would find a way to get into the school building without drawing attention, and then slip into the hallway near Mark's classroom. She would leave the phone on record, tucked away, and hope it captured the truth. It wasn't easy. Emma had to wait for the right moment. She needed to make sure the teachers and staff were busy with their own duties, so she wouldn't be noticed. The school was crowded with students and teachers, but Emma kept her head down, trying to blend in. Finally, she saw the chance. Mark's class was about to start, and most of the students were filing in. Emma stayed a few steps behind Mark and made her way toward the hallway. She found an empty spot near a door that led to the classroom. She knew Mark would be in there soon, and she could hear the chatter of his classmates getting louder as they took their seats. Emma quickly set the phone on record and left it hidden in a corner. She walked a little farther down the hallway, trying to look as casual as possible. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Emma kept her eyes on the door, hoping to hear something that would confirm her worst fears. She knew it was risky, but she couldn't give up. She had to protect her brother, and this was the only way to get the truth out. Finally, Emma heard voices. She could make out the sound of Mrs. Hall's voice, speaking sternly to the class. Her heart skipped a beat. This was it. She took a deep breath and made sure she was well out of sight. From her hidden spot, she could hear the unmistakable sound of the classroom door opening, followed by the shuffle of students taking their seats. Emma listened carefully, praying that the phone was recording everything. From her vantage point, she couldn't hear the exact words, but she could tell that something was going on. The class grew quieter, and she could hear Mrs. Hall's sharp tone. Emma held her breath, hoping the phone would capture the tension in the room. What happened next would change everything. Emma had to be brave. This was the proof she needed. She couldn't wait any longer. The days seemed to drag on as Emma anxiously waited for the next opportunity to check the recording. She tried to act normal around Mark, doing her best to hide her growing concern, but every time she thought about the situation, her heart ached. She couldn't stop thinking about the phone she had hidden in the hallway, hoping it had captured what she needed to prove that Mark wasn't just acting out, but was being mistreated. The day after she had left the phone recording, Emma couldn't wait any longer. She rushed home after school, eager to see what the phone had captured. Mark had already gone to his room, so Emma took a few moments to herself. She sat down at the kitchen table, took a deep breath, and began to play the recording. Her hands trembled as she pressed play, unsure of what she would hear, but determined to get to the truth. At first, there was only the soft background noise of students settling into their seats. Then, Emma heard Mrs. Hall's voice. Her tone was sharp, almost scolding. Emma's stomach tightened. She had heard that tone before, the one Mark dreaded, the one that made him shrink into himself. The voice on the recording grew louder, and soon Emma could hear Mrs. Hall's instructions to the class. Emma held her breath, waiting for the moment she feared the most. Then it happened. Emma could hear Mrs. Hall's voice grow more frustrated, her words more impatient as she spoke to Mark. Mark's response was barely audible, but Emma could hear the hesitation in his voice, the nervousness that always came when he had to explain something he didn't fully understand. The recording was clear. Mark wasn't misbehaving. He wasn't acting out. He was simply struggling, trying his best, but the teacher didn't seem to care. And then, Emma heard something that made her blood run cold. Mrs. Hall's sharp instructions came through the phone as she told Mark to move to the corner of the room. The sound of Mark's footsteps could be heard, followed by a faint rustling as he sat down in the corner. Emma's heart broke. She had known something was wrong, but hearing it all clearly on the recording made it so much more real. It wasn't just a minor mistake, a simple misunderstanding. This was a pattern. Mrs. Hall's repeated harshness, the way she isolated Mark instead of helping him. The more Emma listened, the more it became clear that Mark was being treated unfairly, that his struggles were being dismissed. The phone had captured everything: the scolding, the isolation, the helplessness that Mark felt every single day. Emma sat back in her chair, stunned and overwhelmed by what she had just heard. The tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. She knew she couldn't cry now, not when she had to act. She had the proof she needed, and now she couldn't sit back any longer. The truth was out there, and Emma was going to make sure that someone listened. But what could she do next? Emma knew that bringing this to light wouldn't be easy. Mrs. Hall was a respected teacher, and many of the other parents might not believe that she would act this way. Emma took a deep breath, steeling herself. She had to do this for Mark. She had to show her parents what was happening, and then she had to make sure the school took action. With the recording saved on her phone, Emma knew the next step was crucial. She couldn't let it go unnoticed. Mark deserved to feel safe at school, to feel like he belonged, and Emma wasn't going to stop until she made sure that happened. Emma sat on her bed, her mind racing as she stared at her phone. The recording was undeniable, the evidence clear, but the next step was critical. She knew that bringing the truth to light wouldn't be easy. Mrs. Hall had been a teacher for years, and no one would want to believe that she could treat a student like that. Emma needed to be strategic, calm, and most importantly, make sure Mark would be protected. She had to share the recording with her parents, but she didn't want to just show them the evidence without preparing them for what they were about to hear. She needed them to understand how serious this was and how deeply it was affecting Mark. He was already so fragile from his experiences at school, and Emma didn't want him to feel like his own family didn't believe him or care. The next day after school, Emma sat her parents down in the living room. Mark was in his room, trying to focus on his homework, but Emma knew she needed to have this conversation in private. Her hands trembled as she held the phone, unsure of how to start. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. "Mom, Dad, I need to talk to you about something," Emma began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's about Mark's school." Her parents looked up, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What's going on?" her mom asked, her face instantly filled with concern. Emma hesitated for a moment, then pressed play on the phone. As the sounds of the classroom filled the room, she watched her parents' faces change. They were quiet, listening intently. When the recording reached the part where Mrs. Hall ordered Mark to the corner of the classroom, Emma's mom gasped. Her father's expression hardened. Emma turned off the phone and looked at her parents. "This isn't the first time this has happened," she said softly. "I've seen it with my own eyes. Mrs. Hall treats Mark like he's misbehaving when all he's doing is struggling. He's not lazy, and he's not trying to be difficult. He's just trying to learn, and she's not giving him the chance." Her parents were silent for a long moment. Her mom looked upset, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. Her dad, who had been so dismissive of Mark's struggles, finally spoke. "I didn't know. I didn't realize it was this bad," he said, his voice low. He rubbed his forehead as if the weight of the situation was just sinking in. "I thought we were doing the right thing by sending him there. But this isn't right." Emma nodded, relieved that they understood, but also heartbroken. "I want to talk to the school," she said firmly. "I need to make sure that this doesn't keep happening to Mark or anyone else. He deserves better than this." Her mom nodded. "You're right, Emma. We need to do something. We can't just let it go." After their discussion, Emma felt a sense of determination wash over her. She had the support of her parents now, and she wasn't going to let Mark suffer any longer. Together, they agreed to go to the school the next morning. They would speak to the principal, show the recording, and demand that something be done to address what had been happening. It was time to take action. The next day, Emma's parents called the school and arranged a meeting with the principal. Emma was nervous, but she was also resolute. She knew this was the right thing to do. As they sat in the principal's office, waiting for the meeting to begin, Emma couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: anxiety, anger, but also hope. This could be the moment that changed everything for Mark, and Emma wasn't going to let anything stop her. The truth was out, and now it was time to make sure it was heard. The meeting with the principal was set for the next morning, and Emma could feel the weight of what was about to happen. Her heart raced as she sat beside her parents in the principal's office. They were all nervous, but Emma knew that this was something they had to do. They couldn't let Mark's suffering go unnoticed. She glanced at her parents, who looked just as serious and determined as she felt. Today was the day they were going to make sure something changed. The principal, Mr. Harris, was a kind man, known for being fair and approachable, but Emma couldn't help but wonder how he would react to hearing about what had been happening behind the scenes. Would he believe them? Would he take the situation seriously? She looked down at her hands, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve, as she tried to calm her nerves. When Mr. Harris finally walked into the room, He greeted them politely, but there was an underlying tension in the air. Emma felt like she couldn't take her eyes off him. She had to be sure that her message was heard loud and clear. After exchanging pleasantries, they quickly got to the point. Emma's dad spoke first, his voice steady but firm. "We need to talk about our son, Mark," he began, his tone serious. "We've learned that he's been facing mistreatment at school. We have evidence to show what's been happening, and we want it to stop." Mr. Harris looked surprised, his eyebrows furrowing. "Mistreatment? What exactly are you referring to?" he asked, clearly concerned but also uncertain. Emma's mom took a deep breath, then spoke. "Mark has been isolated and punished unfairly. His teacher, Mrs. Hall, has been treating him as though he's misbehaving, when in fact, he's simply struggling due to his learning disability. He's been sent to the corner of the room, made to sit alone, and scolded repeatedly for things that are out of his control. We have a recording that proves it." Emma pulled out her phone, her hands shaking slightly as she passed it over to Mr. Harris. "We recorded a session in the classroom. You can hear how Mrs. Hall speaks to Mark and the way she treats him. He isn't given any help or understanding. We can't let this go on any longer." Mr. Harris listened carefully as the recording played through the phone speaker. Emma watched his face closely, trying to read his reaction. She saw his expression shift as he heard the harshness in Mrs. Hall's voice, the frustration in Mark's tone, and the uncomfortable silence that followed as Mark was ordered to the corner. As the recording ended, Mr. Harris sat back in his chair, clearly processing what he had just heard. The room fell silent for a few moments, and Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She held her breath, hoping for a response. Finally, Mr. Harris spoke. "I had no idea this was happening. I'm truly sorry. This is not acceptable, and we will take immediate action to ensure Mark and any other student who may be experiencing something similar are treated with the respect and care they deserve." Relief washed over Emma, but she didn't let herself relax just yet. She had heard words like this before, from teachers and administrators who promised change but didn't follow through. "What exactly will be done to make sure this doesn't happen again?" she asked, her voice firm but hopeful. "We will be launching an investigation into the matter right away," Mr. Harris assured them. "I will speak with Mrs. Hall about her behavior, and we will provide additional support for Mark and any other students with similar needs. If necessary, we will arrange for a different teacher for Mark. His well-being is our priority." Emma couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had expected some resistance, maybe even a defense of Mrs. Hall's actions, but instead, the principal was taking it seriously. The words "immediate action" gave her hope. Still, she knew it wasn't over. There was work to be done, and she would make sure it was followed through. As the meeting ended, Emma felt a mix of emotions: relief, gratitude, and a quiet sense of victory. They had spoken up for Mark, and finally, someone was listening. Emma couldn't wait to tell him the good news. He was going to be okay, and things were going to change for the better. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, Emma felt like they were on the right path. The next few days felt like a whirlwind to Emma. After the meeting with Mr. Harris, she and her parents were filled with a mix of emotions: relief, but also a quiet anticipation. They had done what they could, but Emma knew that change didn't happen overnight. There was still so much to be done. She had done her part by speaking up for Mark, but now it was time to make sure the school followed through on its promises. Mark seemed to sense the change too. He came home that day looking a little more hopeful, a small glimmer of light in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Emma noticed how he didn't slump into his chair as he usually did, but instead sat up straight, and even gave a small smile when she asked how his day went. "It was better today," he said quietly. "Mrs. Hall didn't raise her voice, and I didn't have to sit in the corner." Emma couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. She had made this happen, not just for Mark, but for all the other kids who might be going through something similar. She couldn't change everything, but she could make a difference for her brother. In the following weeks, Emma kept in touch with Mr. Harris, who kept his word. The school started implementing a plan to provide more support for students with learning disabilities, and Mark was reassigned to a new classroom with a teacher who had more experience working with children like him. Emma felt relieved knowing that Mark would no longer be treated unfairly. The new teacher, Mrs. Reynolds, was kind and patient. She took the time to understand Mark's learning needs, and for the first time in a long while, Mark felt safe and supported in class. The changes at school weren't just about Mark. Emma had learned that her voice could make a difference, even in a place where it seemed hard to be heard. The principal's quick action showed her that sometimes speaking out can lead to real change. The situation with Mrs. Hall was addressed, though Emma never knew exactly what steps were taken. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that Mark's well-being was now the school's priority. Emma also noticed a change in her parents. They were more involved in Mark's education, asking him about his day and helping him with his homework. Her dad, especially, seemed more understanding. It was as if the weight of the situation had opened his eyes to just how hard Mark had been working all along. He was no longer dismissive of Mark's struggles, but instead, he supported him more than ever. Mark started showing signs of his old self again. He was more confident, smiling more often, and even participating more in class. He wasn't perfect, but he was learning, and for Emma, that was enough. She felt a deep sense of gratitude for the progress they had made, even though the journey hadn't been easy. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Mark turned to Emma and smiled. "Thanks for helping me," he said softly. "I know I'm not always good at school, but you still help me. I think I can do it now." Emma smiled back, her heart swelling with pride. "You can do anything, Mark. You've always been smart. I just want you to believe in yourself." They both laughed, and Emma felt a warm feeling spread through her chest. She had done it. She had fought for her brother, and she had won. The road ahead wasn't without challenges, but Emma knew that with her family by his side, Mark would never have to face them alone. As the months passed, Emma continued to advocate for her brother. She stayed involved with the school, ensuring that the changes promised were being carried out. She also became a voice for other children who had been overlooked, advocating for more resources and support for kids with learning disabilities. Emma's efforts didn't stop with her family. She became determined to make a positive impact on the whole community. In the end, Emma learned that even the smallest voice could create ripples of change. What started as a simple act of looking out for her brother grew into something much bigger. She had taken a stand, not just for Mark, but for all children who needed someone to believe in them. And that was the most important thing of all.